He didn't say another word on the subject and went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down at the front garden. The cat, it was staring down Privet Drive as though it were waiting for somebody. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think what he could bear it. The Dursley got to bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come here. There was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley's. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect him or them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting off into an uneasy sleep, but that cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkably on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street or when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared. On the corner, the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently you would have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and his eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old. Judging by the silver of his hair and his beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt, he was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept to the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling with half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his coat looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize that he was being watched because he looked up suddenly at the cat. But he did seem to realize he was being watched because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and mumbled, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to have been a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open and held it up in the air and then clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next light flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the putter-outer until only lights left on the street were two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of the window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't have been able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the putter-outer back into his coat and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing a square glasses exactly the shape of the markings that the cat had on its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How do you know it was me?" she said. "Oh, dear Professor, I've never seen a cat to sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff, too, if you'd been sitting on that brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you should have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You think that they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jutted her head back towards the Dursleys' dark living room. "I heard it. Flocks of owls shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent? I bet that was Degulus Diggle. He had never had much sense." "You can't blame him," said Dumbledore gently. "We had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless, out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She drew a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't. So she went on. "A fine thing it would be if, on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out all about us. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. That's a kind of Muggle sweet. I'm rather fond of it." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think that for a she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like you can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense for 11 years? I've been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to have noticed. "It gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I've never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you-know-who, all right, Voldemort, was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort has powers I will never have, only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me that she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know that what everybody's saying about why he disappeared, about what finally stopped him." It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she'd been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore said it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop, and so did not answer. "What they say," and she passed on, "is that last night Voldemort turned up at Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James? I can't believe it. I don't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulders. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying that he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry. But he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true, faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he has killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? It's just astounding. All of the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, says Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out her lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff and took his golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very old watch. He had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around its edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it's he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people that live here, sighed Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at the number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us, and they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter come to live here? It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, you think you could explain this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can even walk or talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he will be growing up away from all of that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak, and suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it, Hagrid's bringing him. You think that's wise? To trust Hagrid with something so important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, says Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, says Professor McGonagall grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. And he does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of headlights. It swelled to a roar. They both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorbike fell out of the air, landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild, long tangles of bushy black hair and a beard that hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast muscular arms he was holding a bundle of blankets. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. "At last. And where did you get that motorcycle?" "Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir," said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. "Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir." "No problem, was there?" "No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the Muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol." Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead. They could see a curiously shaped cut, like that of a lightning bolt. "Is that where?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He will have that scar forever." "Can't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" "Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee that's a perfect map of the London Underground." "Well, give him here, Hagrid. We better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir?" said Hagrid. He bent his great shabby head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You wake the Muggles." Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face into it. "I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles." Yes, it's all very sad. But get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or you will be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on his arms as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden and as Dumbledore stepped over the large garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took out a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations." "Yes," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I'll be taking Sirius his bike back. Good night, Professor McGonagall." "Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose up into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding at her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked down the street. On the corner he stopped and took out his silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back to the street lamps, so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat sitting on the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he mumbled. He turned on his heel, and with a swish of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silently and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place you would ever expect anything astonishing to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the ladder beside him. He slept and he slept on, not knowing that he was special, not knowing that he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles. Nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dursley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy that lived." End of chapter 1.